David, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure and a true privilege to meet you. And on behalf of this group, we are very grateful for the generosity, and this is the right word, the generosity of sharing your precious time with us. And we are above all thrilled to be here with you. We know that you receive many invitations, and this, of course, only makes us even more grateful for the opportunity of having this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, David, as I mentioned in our emails, this is a group composed by business and thought leaders of many of Brazil's leading companies and institutions, and most of them are on boards of directors or C-level. And under this leadership program, we are debating critical issues every month. And on top of that, we have these special sessions with leading thinkers like yourself, who are, our guides, let's say this way, to think better about these subjects and, of course, to act accordingly. And for the sake of starting this event in a more formal way, and because we are recording this event, I would like to highlight to all participants that Dave Stroh is the author of the best-selling book, Systems Thinking for Social Change, this wonderful book here, a practical guide to solving complex problems which we have a lot of them nowadays, avoiding unintended consequences and achieving lasting results. It's a wonderful book. I strongly recommend to everyone. And I truly believe that, systems thinking, it's absolutely critical for anyone, in particular for leaders in this very interconnected world that we live in. And David is devoted to effecting lasting change, with mission-centered leaders and organizations. He's the founder and principal partner of Bridgeway Partners, which is a premier consulting firm that helps organizations and leaders to advance social and environmental transformation. And David also has co-founded with Peter Senge, and we have had a conversation this year, David, with Peter, which was wonderful as well. And so David co-founded with Peter Senge one of the first firms to apply systems thinking to learning organizations. And clients, as far as I could see, describe you as a magician, who possesses the kind of the mind of a scientist and the heart of a healer. So David was also a National Science Foundation Fellow at MIT, where he earned an MA in city planning and graduating summa cum laude with degrees in civil engineering and urban studies from the University of Michigan. So, David, without further ado, I'm going to kick off this conversation with 4 or 5 questions. As you know, I would have many more, and then open for other questions from the members of our group, whom I also greet and thank very much as well for being here. Okay. So let's go.
Great.
David, I would like to start off our conversation with, this big concept of interconnectedness, which is at the very heart of system thinking. And as you know much better than us, we have intensified our web of interconnectedness around the world over the last decades. And as a result, and I would say more than ever, our daily actions and decisions can affect people and other forms of life on the other side of the planet and vice versa. However, this accelerating curve of interconnectedness has not been followed by an increase in our ability to understand this and by our increase in our awareness as human beings to feel connected with other people and with nature. In fact, as you also, of course, know very well, we have seen a growing polarization, a growing fragmentation, both within and among countries in the past few years. So how do you see this issue? Are you hopeful that we can change our current, unfortunately, collective route it doesn't look very well, and develop a healthier way of being and living here on Earth?
I love big questions. And I've actually been doing some reflecting about these particular paradoxes, I believe, that you're describing over the past few years. I would start by saying absolutely systems thinking teaches us that everything is connected. But we don't have to go much further than our own experience when in relationships with others to see that some of those connections are fruitful and beneficial, and some of them are dysfunctional. And whether they are beneficial or dysfunctional is a function of what that system is designed to accomplish. Are we, for example, in a personal relationship trying to experience supporting each other, or are we trying to be right and get our way? Those are connections, but they lead in very different directions depending on what we're choosing. At a global level, I believe that what is happening is that the larger global system is designed to maximize profit. And maximizing profit with the accounting systems that we currently have, as you know, typically favors private gain at the expense of social and environmental cost. I've been particularly interested in the polycrisis that some people are talking about, that we're seeing simultaneously globalization, rising wealth inequality, rising ethnic tensions, rising climate change, rising populism and authoritarian leadership. And to me, all of those are connected and related to this underlying purpose or direction of profit maximization. So, for example, globalization has benefited enormous numbers of people in developing countries. And the number of people lifted out of poverty in recent decades is something we can all feel really good about. At the same time that wealth inequality has leveled somewhat between fully developed countries and developing countries, it has increased within those countries. And particularly, let's look at, more developed nations. Because the people who benefit most from globalization and from profit maximization are investors, they're business owners, and that's linked with political leadership. And at the same, so we have a dynamic in systems which is called the success to the successful. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, that is not necessarily something that is tied to capitalism. It happens in all societies. It is a tendency that we have in the structuring of society. I believe that sustainable societies do a better job of trying to rebalance those inequalities over time through various wealth distribution mechanisms, power leveling mechanisms, and so on, because they recognize that that leads to more economic, social stability over a period of time. But we are letting that get out of hand in the West. One way in which people then, so the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. within these nations. One way that people who are wealthier and more powerful hold on to and further accumulate wealth and power is through what I have come to call ethnic manipulation or identity politics. Take the people who are most hurt by the economic system and divide them. Set the white people against the colored people. Set the native people against the immigrants, and so on. Now, what that leads to, and another way in which wealthy people tend to hold on to and further accumulate wealth and power is to drag their feet around climate action. Because a lot of our economy is tied to the fossil fuel industry. A lot of people make their money off of it directly or indirectly. And I believe they're very reluctant to step up to the level of intervention and change that is required to really address the seriousness of climate change. What they are able to do with whether it's ethnic manipulation or identity politics, and now currently called in the US at least, is that they increase fear and they increase anger amongst the majority of the population. And those people, when they are afraid and angry, look to authoritarian leaders to take care of them, and particularly authoritarian leaders of their own ethnicity or color or whatever it is. Those authoritarian leaders are promising them, of course, that, we'll take care of you. But as we also see, the support of authoritarian leaders further concentrates wealth and power, which leads us back into these multiple cycles. So what we really need to do is think about what is the purpose of the system that we want to create. Now it says confirm my speaking language. I think I better confirm that as English.
Yeah.
I don't know how this got here.
Yes.
Let me go back up. Hold on. There we are. Okay,
So,
great. Do we want to design a system for profit maximization? That's what we already have. We can see where that is leading us. Or do we want to design a system for sustainability, for better quality of life, for the support of our natural environment, without which we are not going to survive very well? And we have to make a decision deeply, I believe, at the level of purpose. What are we really trying to accomplish? The economic system is well designed to achieve profit, but we can see all of the negative consequences of doing that.
so as far as I could understand, David, we have to address this kind of leverage point in the language of systems thinking, which is to change at the very base, of the very core, the goal of the system,
Yes.
rather than trying, some quick fixes, which is basically something that you emphasizes in your book wonderfully, which is basically my next question, because you highlight, David, that these systemic issues with vicious cycles that we have, as you mentioned, that's taking place nowadays, they often worsen when organizations or leaders focus on quick fixes rather than addressing underlying causes. And you also point out that attempts at social change often generate unintended consequences. And as far as I can understand, this is in line with one of the laws of systems thinking, which says that today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So could you please, David, share an example from your vast experience at Bridgeway Partners and before that demonstrates how organizations or societies have successfully managed or at least mitigated unintended consequences using systems thinking?
Thank you for asking. An example that I like to return to, because I have a little more data on it over a period of time, is the efforts of a county in the state of Michigan in the United States to reduce or really to end homelessness. And there was a high degree of it. There was a homeless coalition that had been meeting for about 10 years, all committed to ending homelessness, all getting very frustrated, competing for limited amounts of funds, and at the same time had gotten an offer from the state of Michigan to develop a 10-year plan to end homelessness. And if that plan was approved by the state, they would get state funding to help them with that. Now, normally in a situation like that, we've learned enough to try to get quote unquote the whole system in the room, get the different stakeholders represented. And those leaders in this case came from the business community. In this particular county, they came from government at the local and county and state and even federal levels. They came from the nonprofit sector and the social workers who were helping the homeless people. And very, very importantly, they also came from an advisory group of homeless people themselves. So in the business world, we talk about the importance of customer-centered design. And here, the ultimate beneficiary was intended to be homeless people. And so they were included in the planning process. So it's one thing to get all of, quote unquote, all of the stakeholders in the room. And obviously, that's not easy in and of itself. But the other thing that most groups in these situations don't have is the ability to think about the ways in which the current system works and doesn't work, to think about the interdependence between the different parts of the system, the parts that they are immediately concerned about, but also to them, the more peripheral parts that are the most important thing to somebody else in the system. And how do you show that interdependence in a way that people really get it? They see what it does do, what it does accomplish, which is usually shorter term quick fixes and results, or it can be designed to achieve the long-term purpose of ending homelessness. In this case, the system was actually designed to help people cope with homelessness, but not end it. And those are very, very different system goals. So the coping mechanism, the quick fix, if you will, that was applied was homeless shelters and also emergency relief for people who had social problems, substance problems, rent problems, but trying to provide these quick fixes. And yet, what was being talked about in the United States at that point, and has become much more popular since, is a more fundamental solution called housing first. Build affordable, safe, permanent housing for people who are homeless and co-locate the services that they need, whether those be mental health or substance abuse issues, or hopefully, somewhat easier to tackle economic issues and finding jobs and getting skills training and so on. And that has been shown to work. So the question was, well, if we know that works, if we know that's the fundamental solution, why aren't we implementing it? And what they discovered, much to their concern, is that the very quick fixes they were using to help people cope with homelessness actually undermined their ability to end homelessness in a number of different ways. First of all, they provide homeless shelters, and particularly if you put them on the edge of town, which they did, they took them out of the main business district and put the shelters where most people couldn't see them. You have out of sight, out of mind. There was less community pressure at that point to try to motivate a more fundamental solution. In addition, the homeless shelters themselves had a pretty good business going in the sense that they filled their beds, and because they filled their beds, they got money, they had employees, they helped people out. There was a feeling of we're being helpful here. And so there were a lot of benefits. When you have a system that is quote unquote dysfunctional, you also need to realize what the payoffs are. What is it actually accomplishing that people do want to accomplish? They want to be able to make a living. They want to be able to make a living helping people. And on top of it, the funders themselves discovered, wait a second, we're paying these shelters to fill their beds. And that should be a good thing. But think about it further. If you're trying to end homelessness, you don't want 100% full shelter beds. You want people with a permanent roof over their heads. And so the funders themselves were supporting these quick fixes because it felt good. There were short-term benefits. And however, at the expense of their stated commitment to end homelessness. That system was not going to end it. And so they really had to look hard at what are we committed to here? What are we funding? And how do we need to shift the funding? How do we need to support, in this case, the one home in town that was designed as transitional housing to more permanent housing, and not keep funding the shelters that were just trying to provide a bed for a night and then ask people to leave in the morning. And people who were dedicated to really ending homelessness made compromises in favor of that funding reallocation and rethinking their own approaches to what their shelter was trying to accomplish because of that commitment to a more meaningful purpose, and very importantly, to uncovering how their best intentions to help were actually hurting.
Wow, that's a very clear example, David, because it's a dysfunctional system, but at the same time, it is functional for some parts of the of the system. So,
Yes.
well, I have some other questions, but I'm going to hand over now to Angela, who also coordinates this program with me, and then later, hopefully, I'll continue with at least one or two more questions.
Or I just want to mention one other thing about this whole thing with quick fixes. There's a tendency then to conclude that systems thinking is just about the long term. And that's not true. It's how do you think about the short term in support of the long term? Not just to relieve the immediate symptoms, but to really accomplish what matters to you in the long term. So I distinguish in the book small successes from quick fixes. We need small successes in order to retain motivation, in order to get more funding, whatever it is to keep building toward what we ultimately want. Often those small successes, though, come in the shape of building capacity and building relationships, building new capacities for having productive conversations, building the ability to think systemically, and creating new relationships and more useful relationships among the different stakeholders. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank
And
you.
happy to turn it over to Angela.
Okay. Before my question, I wanted to ask you if we could take a picture.
Oh, sure.
Yes, because
Register this moment.
yes, we have all of us here. So please, if you want to open your camera, so I'll count until three. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Go. Let's see if it's okay. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So David, I was wondering, since you said that this bigger this global system that we are is designed for maximizing profits and wealth and power, do you have an example of a country level example of having less concentration of power and wealth? For instance, I don't know if you would consider if the Nordic countries being more socialists, and if you could consider that a different view in the system to a more egalitarian society. So this is one question, and the other one is once you were you were talking about the shelters. I was thinking the case of Buurtzorg. It is a healthcare company in the Netherlands and other countries, and and they got from almost 4 nurses to more than 10,000 nurses in 10 years and 80% of market share. And their goal was to have more people having autonomy, having their own autonomy. So their goal was to have less work for them and and having their clients to get better sooner. That's why they got a lot of, they received a lot of awards and etc., including the United Kingdom award for because the contribution for the UK government for health was safe by the contribution of this company. So would you say, would this be a case of a different thinking and a different systems thinking to change the perspective and then change their own impact in the world?
So let's see. Let me go back to the country level for a moment. My understanding, and I have not been in a Nordic country in a long time, but what I have read and what I have seen is that there is more of an egalitarian culture. Um, and my understanding is that government thinks of itself more as both a investor and a wealth redistributor than as a regulator. And so government still has an important role, but it's not the role that it ends up having in the US so much, which leads to enormous conflict between business and government. There tends to be more of a synergy between those two institutions. They are, of course, more homogeneous societies. And I'm not sure whether immigration pressures now are causing more tension in those countries. I would expect that they would be. But again, it's partly a function of what are we trying to accomplish, in that if we see immigration to a certain level, not overwhelmed, but to a certain level as a society that can benefit from diversity, rather than a threat, it's more a benefit to the existing population. Then if we make that choice and head in that direction, I think we're more likely as a government to succeed in maintaining that egalitarian quality. So again, I think there is a matter of choice here. Do we fan the fear? Do we fan the negative consequences, or do we cultivate the more positive consequences? When it comes to the healthcare company, what I love about this story is that, and you use the word more autonomy, is that leverage points are often counterintuitive. You do the exact opposite of what you think you should do. And these folks seem to be committed to building independence rather than dependence on the part of their clients. Most companies look for creative ways to build more dependence, not less. And as a result, you get this overproduction and over marketing and overselling of stuff that people don't need or that makes matters worse. The side effects of that dependence. And these folks have decided that it's better to work themselves out of a job, and as a result, their job gets bigger. Brilliant. I love it.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, David.
So now I think it's Sylvia, right?
Yeah.
Hello. I wanted to go back to your example of the homeless, to think in terms of what is the purpose to be achieved in the longer term, and what are the elements that would go into achieving that purpose. Wouldn't you need to have a kind of diagnosis of how that problem arises, and have a shared belief that those are the causes, and therefore to deal with this issue, you have to have several elements. And so my question is this shared view of what the diagnosis of the problem is, something that's necessary. And what happens when you have a lot of social problems, but it's not necessarily the case that people share the idea of what causes and what needs to be done. So could you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of answer this, I think, in two different ways. One is that clearly one of the causes of homelessness in that county is what happened throughout what we call the Rust Belt in the United States. The exporting of manufacturing jobs to lower worker cost countries. So it was clear to the community, it became clear that homelessness is connected to economic development. Now, we have to choose any time you work on a quote unquote systems problem, you've got to create some boundaries because ultimately everything is connected to everything else, and you've got to decide what are we going to focus on versus acknowledge needs to be addressed by not by us, but to connect with other stakeholders who are more able to and politically and legally bound to address another part of the system. So it didn't mean that this homeless coalition and this group of leaders were all of a sudden going to get into the economic development work, but they could raise it for sure and say, we can do our job better collectively to mitigate, to reduce the consequences of economic crises. But you folks over here are going to have to really address what we can do to develop a more sustainable economy in the long term. It turns out that what was it? I think the third year of operation of their 10-year plan to end homelessness, which they did get approved in service of more permanent, affordable, supportive housing. The third year of implementation of that plan was the downturn of 2008, the economic downturn, and already a very vulnerable community. And the number of evictions dropped, and the number of homeless people dropped, even though unemployment went up. Because they had thought ahead about how to help people have a permanent roof over their heads. So you can, by addressing your part of the system in a healthier, more constructive way, you can at least reduce some of the negative consequences of what happens in another part of the system. And ideally, you can point to some of these interdependencies and encourage people with other specializations to do what they can do in the system. When it comes to your other related question about do we need a shared diagnosis, I would say in my experience, there are two anchors to any kind of systems change. One is a shared aspiration of some kind, and that you can call that vision, mission, purpose, values. What do we have in common that we're trying to accomplish? And a shared understanding of not only what is happening that is keeping us from accomplishing that, but most importantly, why? Why, despite our best efforts, are we not able to accomplish what we say we really care about and want to accomplish? That requires a certain level of curiosity, which in turn requires a certain level of humility. And when I start working with people, the first thing I want to do is have them formulate a why question that they're going to answer. Because everybody comes in with a sense that we're part of the solution, somebody else is part of the problem. I'm doing my best by optimizing my part of the system, but somebody else isn't doing what they need to be doing. And what we know about the improvement of system performance, system-wide performance, is that it's a function of improving the relationships among the parts of the system, not optimizing each part separately. So a professor emeritus of leadership at Boston College, a guy named Bill Torbert, once said, if you are not aware of how you are part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. That's a very powerful statement because it relocates the sense of responsibility for what is to each of those people in the system. And to me, the greatest control that any of us have over a more complex system is through our own intentions, our own thinking, and our own actions. It doesn't mean it stops there, but it has to start there. If we spend most of our time complaining about and trying to manipulate other stakeholders who aren't, quote unquote, doing what they're supposed to do, that system is not going to change. So I tell people when I work with them, I'm going to start with the assumption. And I ask people, how many of you feel you're part of the solution? Everybody raise their hand. How many of you think you're part of the problem? Maybe, don't know. And to me, I tell everyone in the room, I believe I'm going to start with the assumption that you're all part of the problem, as well as part of the solution. Not to blame you, not to ask you to turn that blame in toward yourself, but to empower you. Because that's where you can start. Not where you end, but it's where you can start. And so we develop a systems analysis that shows people how typically their best intentions to accomplish something are effective in the short term, but because of longer term unintended consequences, are not only disrupting and making it difficult for other stakeholders in the system, but also making it difficult for them to accomplish what they really accomplish. And that shared understanding of why, despite our best efforts, we're not able to accomplish what we really want to accomplish, that's a shared diagnosis, if you will. And I would also add to that, it's a shared diagnosis of the answer to a why question. The why question establishes a boundary for the system that is manageable for those of us who are here or whom we're trying to influence to address. Ironically, although we call them systems maps, they never map a whole system. That's a misleading term. At their best, to me, they map the answer to a focusing question that folks are concerned about.
That's wonderful, David. Thank you so much. And please, let me also thank publicly Lara Bezerra, who made this conversation possible by connecting me with David. And David, thank you very much once again for your generosity. And I needed to make this public mention to Lara because it all came from her. So Danny, please, Daniela.
Oh, thank you. Yes, wonderful. Actually, my question is in this direction also, but I remembered a phrase that I heard of a complexity teacher one time that she said that when you say you are stuck in the traffic, remember that you are the traffic. And it is exactly what you are talking about, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I work with sanitation, and definitely it is a complex problem, right? And because of that, I have been studying a lot systemic thinking and complexity. And we know that with complex problems, we have to work with collaboration, right? And I have been trying to work in this sense. And what I'm feeling that it is possible to work in a collaborating manner without working with ourselves, because it is a question like we need to work with our ego, with our shadows, and with everything to be in order to be to work with humility, and it is a question of level of consciousness. And to talk about this, we have to work within, right? And because of that, I would like to listen your opinion if we are going to some direction in system thinking and in complexity without to look within, and without to consider that we need to calm down our egos and to see that we are one, right? And actually, I would like to listen your opinion about that.
Well, I very much agree that, as I said, we need to understand our contributions to being the traffic, as you said. And I find it's best to make that a legitimate part of the conversation early. Not to emphasize it necessarily, but again, to say, as we all address this issue together, I'm going to start with the assumptions that you're all part of the solution. Otherwise, hopefully you wouldn't be here, but that you're also all part of the problem. And that kind of levels the playing field a little bit. And it puts everyone on an equal level in the sense of we can't just be looking for who to blame or who to fix, but we also need to be thinking about our own contributions. At the end of my book, I talk about systems thinking. It's not just about thinking. So there is a cognitive part of systems thinking, the understanding of complexity and how it works and how systems work. But there's also an emotional intelligence about how to work and communicate with other people in a way that acknowledges our contribution to whatever is going on. And a level again of curiosity about understanding about what other people's points of view are and so on. There's a behavioral intelligence, which is kind of facilitation work that you do. And in the end, and this goes all the way back, Alexandre, to your question at the beginning, I believe there's a spiritual dimension to this work. Because when we hear, and you introduced it, everybody is connected. And we say, wait a second, I've heard that somewhere before. Where have I heard that? Well, in Western religions, they're all monotheistic religions. In Eastern religions, there is a oneness. It just isn't defined in the same way. Most Eastern religions, not all of them. So what does that mean? It means that we need to develop our character in order to effectively create healthier systems. Leading systems change, in my experience, also requires character development. It requires humility. It requires curiosity. It requires courage, vision, and courage. Courage because it can lead, encourage us to, or require us, in a sense, call us to try to direct the system in a way that most people don't think it should go. Hey, let's design a company where we don't have to sell our products. Huh? That takes some guts. That's courage. It takes patience and persistence because of the long time delays that exist in systems change. So to me, spiritual practice, spiritual development is part of systems change.
Wow, that's
Yeah, it's
beautiful.
beautiful, inspiring. Thank you very much.
And by the way, David, during our conversation with Peter, one of the members of our group who is here, Julio, asked Peter if he would add a sixth discipline 30 years later. And he mentioned the idea of system sensing and complement of systems thinking and to sense more, and I believe that there is this a connection with what you said. So fantastic. And Digital, please go ahead.
Hello. My question is very short, but whenever I face this kind of conversation about system thinking and addressing problems and looking for the causes and so on, we always come to we always mention short term and long term or medium term. And I always have this question about what are the criteria to determine what long term should be. As you mentioned, when we try to deal with the problem, we need to establish boundaries. And does that also apply to the long term you're going to establish to face some problem? That's my question.
I would say that the time horizon to pay attention to is the one that is most useful in answering this focusing question, this why question. Why, often despite our best efforts, are we unable to accomplish what we say we really want to accomplish? And that question to me shapes the diagnosis that I do, that I engage my clients to do with me, because I want them to get unstuck. They want to get unstuck. I want to help them get unstuck. So I work with the time horizon that they're concerned about. So
And
short versus long term, um, if I'm dealing with a conflict with my teenager, then the ramifications of how I connect with him now, you know, okay, Dad, I'll do it. And then 15 minutes later, or half an hour later, an hour later, he hasn't done it. So in the short term, I feel like I'm very powerful. I told him what to do. And then long term is 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever I agreed with him that he should get it done by.
Um, David, can we have time for a last question from myself, or do you have a hard stop? Is it okay?
No, I don't have a hard stop. I'm fine. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. So, David, given our great systemic challenges in areas such as, climate change, as you mentioned, artificial intelligence, socioeconomic inequality, this political polarization, it's obvious that we need a structural transformation at the collective level. And for that, we need leadership. So, could you please share with us what are the core capabilities of a leader with a systemic mindset? How is it possible for someone to kind of start a journey in order to develop these capabilities? And in addition, from what place do you think the leaders capable of carrying out this transformation will emerge? Do you believe, for instance, that we need more leaders from the periphery of the system, from the demographic periphery, the cultural periphery, instead of people from the traditional centers of power, so that this transformation can occur?
I would say that the again, it starts with us. Where are we in the system? And what do we have the ability to control or to influence? And if we are, the CEO of a company or a business owner, we can impact um, potentially whether it's a publicly owned company or it's a privately held company. Is it an employee-owned company? Do we have frontline workers on the management team or the board of directors to make sure that the frontline point of view is represented in an effective way? Um, are we destroying local economies or are we contributing to local economies? Um, are we helping build small businesses or are we taking business away from small businesses? To me, all of those are, and what do we do with our additional money? What do we fund with that money? And where do our investments go? So there are things we can do at the level that we start at. I do think that getting to engage people from the quote unquote periphery is very important because often formal leaders will not change until there's enough pressure building up beneath them. And so if you feel like you want to make a change, but your direct reports don't, for example, then engage the people who are most affected by the decisions that your management team is making. So you don't have to be the one telling them. The rest of the organization will tell all of you what needs to change. It's a lot more effective way if you want to make a change happen. That's another example. I'll tell you, actually, I think it may be very telling. Years ago, we did work with the senior vice president of manufacturing at Procter & Gamble. And he knew enough about systems thinking, and some of the people in the manufacturing organization did, because we had done some training there. And they had an issue with quality in one of the factories. And so what the senior management team there decided to do, instead of saying, let's find out what the problem is and make a decision and keep going, they recruited a group of people from different parts of the company, of different parts of the factory, and said, we want you to talk to other people, do some systems analysis of what the issue is and where the leverage points are, and let us know. And so the team went off and did that, and they came back with some useful insights, and they went to the management team. And instead of the management team saying, okay, we'll do it, they said, this is really good stuff. But have you talked to this other group over here? And have you talked to those suppliers over there? And have you talked to the other factories or the customers? Geez, no, we didn't think of that. Well, why don't you check in with them and just see, what do they think about all this? And as they did that, their insights deepened to the point where the system started becoming aware of itself. And to me, the greatest leverage point is the system becoming aware of itself, both what's working and what isn't, and the contributions of everybody in that system to both what's working and what isn't working. The way the senior VP of manufacturing reported it, by the time the system became aware of itself, it started to make all the changes themselves. They said, wait a second, what we're doing here is crazy. This isn't getting us where we want to go. We need to change this, we need to change that. The senior management team never had to make a decision. And they weren't trying to avoid making a decision. They were genuinely curious about what was going on. So that's part one of the story. The system changed itself because the senior leadership cultivated greater system awareness. Here's part two of the story. Other factories with in Procter & Gamble with a similar problem heard about what had happened in this particular factory. And of course, particularly, what were the solutions they had come up with? And so the other factories tried to implement the solutions that the first factory had come up with. And what do you think happened? The answer is nothing. Because it looked like those solutions were being imposed from the outside. The short-term benefits of making the changes were dominating. And so people resisted implementing what would really serve them in the long term because of all the benefits they were getting from the short term. So a critical insight into this is that you can't just export solutions. You have to recreate a process by which people, as inefficient as it might sound, recreate a process whereby people go through those discoveries, those inquiries and those discoveries and those critical self-assessments on their own. Not just tell me the answer, because that won't do it.
That's such a remarkable example, quite insightful, David. We deeply thank you. It's a lot of food for thought. And I think everyone here is trying to digest so
Yeah.
many interesting things that you brought us. And so, David, on behalf of this group,
just a comment,
yeah,
Alex.
uh-huh.
I wanted to just to make a comment about it. These last words of Professor David is that in 2009, I wrote about how legal transplants didn't work. Analyzing a legal transplant that we did from the
Rules from
other
one country apply to other countries, right?
Yes, from Europe to Brazil, and how it didn't work. And right now I have the answer. Why? Because we needed to recreate the process. So, and we have different agents here, and we have everything different. So that's why. So thank you so much for clarify that.
Sure, I'm glad.
I knew it didn't work, but I didn't know exactly why.
Yeah. Yeah.
We talk so much about the need for change, but we don't think deeply about what makes change lasting and really, a really change and from within. So, David, once again, on behalf of this group, would like to deeply thank you for your generosity in taking your time to be with us. I'm not going to say if this was a once in a lifetime because we always have the hope of listening and being with you once again in the future. It was for sure a memorable occasion for all of us here. And so we just have to thank you. And well, we appreciate it very much this moment with you. Thank you so, so much for all your wisdom. And friends, please, let's all think deeper about David's book. Thank you so, so much, David.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
your wonderful questions and your openness and curiosity, which will take you far. I hope it does.
Wow.
Thank
Hopefully.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, David. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.